Sometimes the richest man in town is the loneliest, and sometimes the woman with nothing left has everything that matters. This is the story of two hearts that forgot how to hope until they found each other. Silas Creed owns half of Pecos County cattle, oil wells, and a big house that echoes with emptiness. Mabel Dunn is a widow who mends clothes in a shack that barely keeps out the wind. When he brings her a torn saddlebag to fix, something happens that neither expected. He's got money and land. She's got wisdom and warmth. But what happens when two people who've given up on love discover it was waiting for them all along? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The sun hadn't yet cleared the horizon when Silas Creed stepped onto the wraparound porch of his ranch house, coffee steaming in his weathered hands. From where he stood, he could see 23 miles in any directional, of it his. The Creed Ranch sprawled across 37,000 acres of prime Texas hill country, dotted with black Angus cattle that moved like dark shadows across the golden grassland. Oil derricks pumped steadily in the distance, their rhythmic nodding a testament to the black gold flowing beneath his feet. At 62, Silas commanded respect from every banker, rancher, and politician in 3 counties. His silver hair caught the morning light as he surveyed his domain, broad shoulders still straight despite the years. His hands, though lined with age, remained steady hands that had built an empire from the small plot his grandfather had left him 40 years ago. Those hands had signed deals worth millions, shaken on agreements that shaped the economy of West Texas, and counted more money than most men saw in a lifetime. Yet as he stood in the morning quiet, listening to nothing but wind through mesquite trees and the distant lowing of cattle, those same hands trembled slightly around his coffee cup. Not from age or cold, but from something deeper, a loneliness so profound it had become his constant companion. The house behind him stretched wide and tall, built for the family he'd always intended to have. 12 rooms, filled with fine furniture from Dallas and Austin, Persian rugs that had cost more than most folks' homes, and crystal chandeliers that caught and scattered light through empty spaces. The dining room table could seat 14, though Silas couldn't remember the last time more than one place had been set. The master bedroom contained a king-sized bed where he slept alone on one side, the other half perpetually smooth and untouched. On the mantelpiece in his study sat an ornate silver frame, 8 by 10 inches, containing nothing but emptiness. He'd bought it years ago with the expectation of filling it with a wedding photograph, then later perhaps with pictures of children. Instead, it had become a monument to absence, a daily reminder of the life he'd planned but never lived. His housekeeper, Mrs. Rodriguez, had worked for him for 15 years and knew better than to ask about his personal life. She prepared his meals, maintained his home, and left him to his solitude. Every morning she set one place at the long dining table. Every evening she cleared away one set of dishes. The routine had become as predictable as the sunrise and just as lonely. Silas finished his coffee and headed to the barn where his foreman, Jake Mendez, was already preparing for the day's work. Jake had been with the ranch for 12 years, a good man with a ready smile and a wife who sent homemade tamales every Christmas. As they discussed the day's tasks, checking on the south pasture fence, moving cattle to fresh grazing, meeting with the oil company representative, Silas found himself watching Jake's easy manner. The way he spoke about going home to Maria and their 3 children. "Boss, you ever think about settling down?" Jake had asked once, years ago, when they'd been working late and sharing a bottle of whiskey. Man needs more than cattle and money to keep him warm. Silas had deflected the question then, as he always did, but the words had stuck. A man needs more than cattle and money to keep him warm. The truth of it echoed through his days and haunted his nights. 15 miles down in the valley, where the land grew poorer and the houses smaller, Mabel Dunn bent over her sewing table in the soft light of dawn. Her fingers, arthritic but still nimble, guided a needle through the sleeve of a child's dress, mending a tear with tiny, precise stitches. At 58, She had the quiet grace of a woman who had known love and loss in equal measure. Her home was a far cry from the grand ranch house on the hill. 3 rooms that leaned slightly to the west, held together by faith and determination more than sound construction. The roof leaked in 2 places, the floorboards creaked with every step, and the windows rattled when the wind picked up. But within those modest walls, Mabel had created something that Silas's mansion lacked entirely: warmth. A hand-stitched quilt, draped across the back of her rocking chair, worked by her grandmother's hands and passed down through 3 generations of women who understood the value of love, stitched into every pattern. The quilt told stories in its patches pieces of her mother's wedding dress, fabric from her own children's clothes, scraps from her late husband's work shirts. Each square held a memory, each thread a connection to the family that had shaped her heart. Mabel had been married to Reverend Thomas Dunn for 26 years before a heart attack took him in his sleep 3 winters ago. Those had been good years, filled with Sunday dinners for the whole congregation, Christmas pageants where she played piano while children sang carols, and quiet evenings when Thomas would read scripture aloud while she mended clothes for families who couldn't afford new ones. After Thomas passed, the church had been kind but practical. They needed the parsonage for the new minister and his young family. Mabel understood and moved, without complaint, to the small house her late husband had inherited from his aunt place. She now rented for almost nothing from distant relatives who were grateful someone was keeping it from falling down. Entirely. The transition from respected minister's wife to poor widow had been swift and humbling. Church members still greeted her warmly on Sundays, but the invitations to dinner had gradually stopped. She was no longer part of their world of married couples and growing families. Instead, she had become one of the church's charity cases, though she worked hard to maintain her dignity and independence. Her sewing had become her salvation. Word spread quietly through the community that Mabel Dunn did fine needlework alterations, repairs, and custom pieces for those who appreciated the careful attention that only hand-stitching could provide. She charged fair prices and delivered beautiful work, each piece bearing the mark of someone who took pride in craftsmanship. But the work was sparse and the pay modest. Most folks in the valley made do with store-bought clothes or learned to do their own mending. Mabel's customers were mainly older women who remembered when all sewing was done by hand, or mothers who needed special occasion dresses for their daughters and couldn't afford the fancy shops in town. Each morning, she rose before dawn and set 2 places at her small kitchen table before catching herself and quietly putting one away. The habit was harder to break than she'd expected. For 26 years, she'd started each day preparing breakfast for 2, and her hands still moved automatically to retrieve the second plate, the extra cup, the additional napkin. Her kitchen held the lingering scents of the meals she'd cooked for Thomas: coffee with cream, biscuits with honey, bacon fried crisp the way he liked it. Now she often forgot to eat, finding herself at noon having consumed nothing but coffee, too absorbed in her work to remember her own needs. The refrigerator held a collection of preserves she'd made from the wild blackberries that grew behind her house, jars of jam that would last her through the winter, though she had no one to share them with. In the pantry, boxes of tea and tins of crackers sat beside a recipe box filled with cards written in fading ink, instructions for the dishes that had once filled her table when company came calling. On Sundays, she still attended the same church where Thomas had preached, sitting in the 3rd pew on the left side where she'd sat for decades. The new minister, Reverend Williams, was a good man with a kind wife and 2 small children, but his sermons lacked the gentle wisdom that Thomas had brought to his messages. Mabel listened politely and sang the familiar hymns, but she often found herself remembering how different the sanctuary felt when it had been filled with Thomas's warm voice and loving presence. After church, she would return to her small house and spend Sunday afternoons on her narrow front porch, watching the occasional car pass on the dirt road that connected the valley to the main highway. Sometimes children walked by on their way to the swimming hole, and she would wave from her chair, remembering when her own children lost to miscarriages early in her marriage might have been among them. The evenings were the hardest. When the sun set behind the hills and shadows grew long across her yard, the silence became overwhelming. She would sit with her sewing, listening to the radio play old hymns and country songs, sometimes catching herself looking toward the door as if expecting Thomas to walk through it with news of his day and requests for tomorrow's meals. Both Silas and Mabel had learned to navigate their loneliness with practiced efficiency. They had routines that filled their days, work that occupied their minds, and carefully constructed barriers that kept the pain of solitude from becoming unbearable. They had accepted their circumstances as permanent, their isolation as the price of the losses they'd endured. Neither suspected that 15 miles of Texas hill country was all that separated two hearts that had forgotten how to hope, hearts that were about to rediscover that love could bloom even in the late afternoon of life, when both had convinced themselves that such possibilities were forever behind them. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across both the grand ranch house and the humble cottage, touching two lives that had been moving in parallel solitude, waiting for the moment when a simple torn saddlebag would bring them together and change everything they thought they knew about second chances. The leather saddlebag had served Silas well for nearly 20 years. Made from premium cowhide and stitched with waxed thread, it had carried everything from ranch documents to his father's old compass through countless rides across his vast property. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as he dismounted near the creek that marked the southern boundary of his land, the bag caught on his saddle horn and tore a jagged rip that ran 4 inches along the main seam. Silas examined the damage with the careful eye of a man who understood quality. The leather was still sound, darkened to a rich brown by years of sun and weather, carrying the honest scent of leather oil and hard work. A skilled hand could repair it properly, making it strong enough to last another 20 years. But this wasn't a job for just anyone with a needle and thread. Jake Mendez would have taken it to his wife Maria, who was handy with alterations. The ranch hands would have suggested the leather goods store in town, where they could patch it with machine stitching and synthetic thread. But as Silas ran his thumb along the torn seam, he remembered a conversation he'd overheard at the bank weeks earlier. "You need something mended right. You take it to Mabel Dunn, old Mrs. Peterson had told the bank teller. "She's got the finest hand with needle and thread in 3 counties. Fixed my mother's wedding dress so perfect you'd never know it had been torn at all." Mabel Dunn, the preacher's widow. Silas knew of her, of course, in a county this size. Everyone knew everyone, at least by reputation. He'd seen her at Thomas's funeral, a small woman in black standing with quiet dignity as the whole community paid their respects to a man who'd married half of them and buried the other half. He remembered thinking at the time that she carried herself with a grace that had nothing to do with money or position. That evening, as Mrs. Rodriguez cleared away his solitary dinner, Silas found himself holding the torn saddlebag and thinking about the widow in the valley. He could easily afford a new bag, could buy a dozen without thinking twice about the cost. But something about throwing away 20 years of faithful service didn't sit right with him. Besides, Mrs. Peterson was known for her exacting standards. If she recommended Mabel Dunn's needlework, it was worth investigating. The next morning dawned clear and cool, with autumn painting the hills in shades of gold and rust. Instead of riding his usual circuit to check on cattle and oil operations, Silas saddled his favorite mare and headed down into the valley. He told himself it was simply practical: get the bag repaired by someone who could do the job right, maybe take a different route back to check on the creek levels. But as he rode the winding dirt road that led to the cluster of modest homes where Mabel lived, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: nervous anticipation. His hands checked his shirt collar twice, and he found himself wondering if he should have worn his better hat. Mabel's house sat at the end of a lane lined with mesquite trees, their branches forming a dappled canopy overhead. The structure was smaller than he'd expected, with weathered wood siding and a tin roof that showed patches of rust. But the yard was tidy, bordered by a garden where late-season tomatoes still hung heavy on their vines, and the front porch held two rocking chairs that suggested someone still believed in the possibility of company. Silas tied his horse to the fence post and approached the front door, the torn saddlebag in his hands. Through the window, he could see a figure bent over what appeared to be a sewing table, and he paused for a moment, suddenly uncertain about disturbing her work. Before he could reconsider, the door opened. Mabel Dunn stood in the doorway, and Silas felt his carefully planned greeting disappear entirely. She was smaller than he'd remembered, maybe 5'4", with graying brown hair pulled back in a simple bun and eyes the color of sage honey. Her dress was plain cotton, faded from many washings, but clean and carefully pressed. Her hands, he noticed, were marked by years of work, but held gracefully at her sides, without the nervous fidgeting he'd expected. "Mr. Creed," she said, and her voice carried the soft warmth of someone accustomed to putting others at ease. "This is a surprise." "Ma'am," Silas managed, removing his hat, "I hope I'm not interrupting your work. I heard you might be able to help me with this." He held up the saddlebag, feeling foolish for the first time in decades. Mabel's eyes went to the torn leather, and her expression shifted to the professional assessment of someone who understood craftsmanship. "May I see it?" She stepped aside, gesturing him into her home, and Silas found himself in a living room that was everything his mansion was not. Where his house felt empty despite its expensive furnishings, hers felt full despite its simplicity. A hand-stitched quilt draped over the back of a rocking chair, its patches telling stories in fabric. Books lined a small shelf, their spines worn from repeated reading. The scent of coffee and something baking, perhaps bread, filled the air with the warmth of a home where someone actually lived. Mabel took the saddlebag to a table near the window, where the morning light fell bright and clear. Her fingers traced the tear with the gentle touch of someone examining a wounded creature. "This is beautiful leather," she said, turning the bag to examine the stitching. "Hand-tooled from the look of it. How long have you had it?" "Near 20 years, Silas replied, surprised by how natural conversation felt in this modest room. "My father gave it to me when I took over running the ranch." "And you'd like to keep using it rather than replace it," Mabel observed, not making it a question. "If it can be properly repaired. I know it's not worth much compared to buying new, but—" "Worth isn't always about money, Mr. Creed," Mabel interrupted gently. "Some things carry value that can't be measured in dollars. This bag has history. That matters." She continued her examination, testing the remaining stitches, checking the condition of the leather around the tear. "I can fix this so it'll be stronger than it was before. The leather is still in excellent condition, just needs proper thread and someone who understands how it was originally constructed." "And you understand that?" Mabel smiled, the first real smile he'd seen from her. "My father was a saddle maker before he became a farmer. I learned to work leather before I learned to cook. This type of stitching," she pointed to the intact seams, "requires waxed linen thread and a specific tension. Most folks today would use cotton thread and a machine. But that wouldn't last." "How long would it take?" "For a proper job, 3 days, maybe 4. I'd need to take apart the damaged section completely and rebuild it. No shortcuts." Silas nodded, impressed despite himself. "And the cost?" $15 for the repair, including materials." He almost laughed. $15 wouldn't buy him lunch at the restaurant in town where he occasionally conducted business. But something in Mabel's tone told him that for her, $15 represented significant income, and she'd quoted the price with the dignity of someone who valued her skills appropriately. "That seems very reasonable," he said. "I don't charge what the market won't bear, Mr. Creed. Folks around here don't have money to throw away on fancy prices." As she spoke, Mabel moved around her small kitchen, and almost without seeming to think about it, she began preparing coffee. The actions were so natural, so unconsciously hospitable, that Silas found himself accepting the offered cup before he'd consciously decided to stay. The coffee was better than what Mrs. Rodriguez made at the Ranch Richer, somehow, though he suspected it cost a fraction of the premium blend he bought by the pound. As they sat at her small kitchen table, Silas became aware of details he'd never noticed in his own home. The way afternoon light fell across worn linoleum floors, the sound of wind chimes on the back porch, the comfortable silence between two people who didn't feel compelled to fill every moment with conversation. "I'll bring the bag back on Friday," he said finally, though he made no move to leave. "That'll be fine," Mabel replied. "Though you don't need to make a special trip, I could have Jake Mendez pick it up when he comes to town." "Jake works for me," Silas said, then realized how that sounded. "I mean, I don't mind the ride. It's a pleasant change from my usual rounds." They sat in comfortable quiet for another few minutes, and Silas found himself studying Mabel's face in profile as she looked out the window at her small garden. There was something peaceful about her, a quality of acceptance that he recognized but had never experienced himself. She seemed complete in a way that had nothing to do with possessions or achievements. When he finally rose to leave, Mabel walked him to the door, still carrying the torn saddlebag. "Mr. Creed," she said, as he settled his hat back on his head, "thank you for trusting me with something that matters to you." The words stayed with him during the ride back to his ranch, echoing in his mind long after he'd unsaddled his horse and returned to his empty house. "Something that matters to you." When was the last time anyone had spoken to him about things that mattered, rather than things that cost money or generated profit? That evening, as he sat in his study looking at the empty picture frame on his mantel, Silas found himself thinking not about the saddlebag, but about the woman who would repair it. For the first time in years, Friday seemed too far away. Silas told himself he was riding down to check the creek levels on Thursday morning, but the silver pocket watch in his vest suggested otherwise. His father's watch had stopped working 3 years ago, its hands frozen at 10 minutes past 2, but he still carried it out of habit. Like so many things in his life, it had become a comfortable weight that marked time's passage without actually measuring it. He found himself taking the long route toward the valley, his mare picking her way along the ridge that offered a distant view of Mabel's small house. Smoke rose from her chimney in a thin grey line, and he could make out a figure moving around the clothesline behind the house. Domestic scene so ordinary it struck him as somehow remarkable. When had he last noticed such details? When had the simple sight of laundry hanging in morning sun seemed worth observing? Yet here he was, a man who owned half the county, finding contentment in watching a woman he barely knew hang shirts and bedsheets to dry. By afternoon, he'd manufactured a reason to ride past her place. The fence line in this section needed checking, he told Jake, though they both knew he'd inspected it thoroughly just 2 weeks before. But Jake simply nodded and suggested taking along some of the new wire they'd ordered, in case any repairs were needed. Mabel was working in her garden when he approached, kneeling beside a row of late tomatoes with a small basket at her side. She looked up at the sound of his horse, shading her eyes against the sun, and Silas felt that same nervous anticipation he'd experienced the day before. "Mr. Creed," she called, rising and brushing dirt from her hands. "You're a day early. The bag isn't quite finished." "Actually, I was just checking the fence line," he said, dismounting and tying his horse to the same post. "Thought I'd see how the work was coming along." If Mabel found his explanation thin, she didn't show it. Instead, she gestured toward her porch. "Would you like some sweet tea? I was about to take a break anyway." The tea was served in mason jars, with ice that clinked pleasantly as she handed it to him. They settled into the 2 rocking chairs, and Silas found himself relaxing into a rhythm of conversation that felt as natural as breathing. "How's the harvest coming?" he asked, nodding toward her garden. "Better than expected. The tomatoes don't seem to know summer's supposed to be over." She smiled, and he noticed how the expression changed her entire face, bringing light to her eyes and softening the lines around them. "I'll have enough to make preserves through Christmas if the frost holds off another week or 2. You do your own preserving?" Thomas, me late husband, used to joke that I could make jam from fence posts if I put my mind to it. The mention of her husband brought a moment of quiet, but not the uncomfortable silence Silas had expected. Instead, it felt like the natural pause that comes when someone shares a treasured memory. "He sounds like he appreciated your talents." He did. 26 years of appreciation. Mabel's fingers traced the rim of her glass. Sometimes I think I keep making preserves because I can't quite believe no one's coming home to eat them. The honesty of the statement caught Silas off guard. In his world, people rarely admitted to such vulnerable truths. Business associates spoke of strategic advantages and calculated risks. Social acquaintances discussed weather and livestock prices. But here was a woman speaking directly about the habits of loss, and somehow it didn't feel inappropriate or uncomfortable. "I understand that feeling," he heard himself say. "I have a dining table that seats 14, and I can't remember the last time I needed more than one chair." Mabel looked at him with new attention, and he realized he'd revealed more about himself in that single sentence than he had to anyone in years. "It's a different kind of loneliness, isn't it?" she said softly. "When you're surrounded by space meant for other people." They sat in the comfortable rhythm of the rocking chairs, each lost in their own thoughts but somehow connected by the shared understanding of solitude. A mockingbird called from the mesquite tree, running through its repertoire of borrowed songs, and Silas found himself thinking that this was what peace might feel like. "Your fence seems to be holding up well," Mabel observed, and he realized she'd been watching him watch her property rather than inspecting any actual fencing. "Yes, it does," he agreed, not bothering to maintain the pretense. "I should probably be getting back." But he made no move to leave, and Mabel made no suggestion that he should. Instead, she began telling him about the history of the small house, how it had belonged to her husband's aunt, who'd lived there alone for 40 years before passing away. "Aunt Clara had 17 cats at one point," Mabel said with gentle amusement. "The whole house smelled like tuna fish and lavender soap. It took me 6 months to get the smell out, but now I almost miss it. It was the smell of someone who lived exactly as she pleased, without worrying what anyone else thought. And now it smells like coffee and whatever I'm sewing. Today it's leather conditioner from your saddlebag. How is the repair coming? See for yourself." Mabel rose and disappeared into the house, returning with the saddlebag. The tear had been meticulously repaired with thread that matched the original stitching so perfectly it was almost invisible. She'd reinforced the area with additional backing, making it stronger than it had been originally, while maintaining the bag's character and appearance. Silas examined her work with genuine amazement. "This is remarkable. You can barely see where it was damaged." "The best repairs are invisible," Mabel said with quiet pride, "like they were never needed in the first place." As he prepared to leave, Silas found himself reluctant to end the conversation. "I don't suppose you'd accept payment today. Save me another trip? The leather oil needs until tomorrow to fully set. Besides," Mabel smiled, "I wouldn't want to deprive you of checking that fence line again." The gentle teasing surprised him. It had been years since anyone had spoken to him with such easy familiarity, and he discovered he liked it. "You might be right about that fence," he admitted. "It probably needs more frequent inspection than I've been giving it." As he rode back toward his ranch, Silas carried with him more than just the promise of a repaired saddlebag. He carried the memory of genuine conversation, of being seen as something more than the sum of his possessions and achievements. Mabel had looked at him not as the richest man in the county, but simply as a man who understood loneliness and appreciated good workmanship. That evening, Mrs. Rodriguez commented on his improved appetite at dinner, and Jake mentioned that he seemed more relaxed during their afternoon meeting about cattle rotation. Silas didn't explain the change, but he felt it in the way his shoulders had loosened, in the way he found himself humming an old song while reviewing ranch accounts. The frozen hands of his father's pocket watch still pointed to 10 minutes past 2, but for the first time in years, Silas found himself looking forward to tomorrow with something approaching anticipation. The fence line would need checking again. He was certain of it. Friday arrived with the first real bite of autumn in the air, and Silas found himself paying unusual attention to his appearance. He chose his best work shirt, the one Mrs. Rodriguez had pressed with extra care, and spent longer than necessary brushing dust from his hat. The saddlebag pickup was scheduled for late morning, but he'd been awake since before dawn, restless with an energy he couldn't name. When he finally rode down to Mabel's house, he found her waiting on the porch with the completed repair and something else that made him smile, a plate covered with a clean kitchen towel. "Your saddlebag is ready," she said, rising from her rocking chair. "And I thought you might like to try some of those preserves I mentioned. Made a fresh batch of biscuits this morning." The saddlebag was perfect, the repair so seamless it looked as though it had never been damaged. But Silas found his attention drawn more to the covered plate and what it represented, the first home-cooked meal anyone had prepared specifically for him in longer than he could remember. "You didn't need to go to such trouble," he said, though he made no move to decline the offering. "No trouble at all. I always make too much anyway." Mabel's tone was casual, but he caught the slight flush in her cheeks that suggested the gesture was more intentional than she was letting on. They settled on the porch again, and Mabel uncovered the plate to reveal golden biscuits, still warm from the oven, accompanied by 3 small jars of preserves blackberry, peach, and what looked like apple butter. "Made these from fruit on the property," she explained, opening the blackberry jar. "The bushes behind the house go wild every summer. Thomas used to say I could feed half the county with what grows back there." Silas bit into a biscuit spread thick with the dark purple jam and had to pause to fully appreciate what he was tasting. The sweetness was perfect, balanced with just enough tartness to make his mouth water for more. The biscuit itself was light and buttery, the kind of homemade goodness that no restaurant could replicate. "This is extraordinary," he said, and meant it. "I'd forgotten food could taste like this." "Like what?" "Like someone cared about making it." The words hung in the air between them, more revealing than he'd intended. Mabel studied his face with gentle attention, and he found himself continuing despite his usual reticence about personal matters. "Mrs. Rodriguez is an excellent cook," he said, "but she cooks for function, not pleasure. This," he gestured to the biscuit, "this tastes like love." "Food should nourish more than just the body," Mabel agreed. "Thomas used to say that meals were how we showed care for each other, even when words weren't enough." As if summoned by the mention of care, Mabel began pointing out small details around her property that spoke of attention and tenderness. The way she'd trained morning glory vines to climb the porch posts, the careful placement of stones to create a path through her garden, the bird feeder positioned just so outside her kitchen window. "You've made this place beautiful," Silas observed. "I've made it mine," she corrected. "When I first moved here, it felt like living in someone else's life. Aunt Clara's furniture, Aunt Clara's curtains, even Aunt Clara's dishes. But slowly, I've been adding pieces of myself." She showed him her recipe box then, a simple wooden container that held cards written in various Hansher mother's flowing script, her grandmother's careful printing, her own neat writing, recording discoveries and adaptations. 3 generations of women who understood that feeding people was how you showed them they mattered, Mabel said, running her fingers over the worn edges of the cards. "Some of these recipes go back to the 1890s. Silas found himself drawn into stories about holiday meals and church suppers, Sunday dinners that brought together extended family and neighbors, celebrations that centered around tables laden with dishes made from love and tradition. It was a world he'd never experienced, growing up in a household focused on building wealth rather than nurturing relationships. "What about your family?" Mabel asked. "Are there recipes you remember from your childhood?" The question caught him off guard. "Mrs. Garrett, our cook when I was young, made decent meals, but I don't recall my mother ever cooking. She considered it beneath her station once the ranch started showing profit." "And your father?" "My father was always working, building the ranch, expanding operations, making deals. He'd eat whatever was put in front of him, without much notice." Silas paused, remembering. "I think the only thing he ever specifically requested was coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. Sounds like a man who needed someone to care for him properly." Maybe. He might not have known what to do with care if he'd received it. The observation settled between them with the weight of recognition. Mabel began packing the remaining biscuits and preserves into a small basket, moving with the efficient grace of someone accustomed to providing for others. "Take these with you," she said. "A man shouldn't live on Mrs. Rodriguez's efficient cooking alone." "I couldn't." "You could and you will. Besides, I told you I always make too much." She secured the cloth over the basket and placed it firmly in his hands. "Consider it payment for all that fence inspection you've been doing." The teasing was gentle but unmistakable, and Silas found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. As he prepared to leave, Mabel walked him to his horse, the repaired saddlebag slung over his shoulder and the basket of food tucked securely in his saddlebags. "Mr. Creed," she said as he mounted, "that fence line of yours seems to need regular attention. Don't be a stranger." "I have a feeling it's going to require frequent inspection," he replied. "Especially with winter coming. Can't be too careful about property maintenance." "Can't be too careful," she agreed, her eyes bright with shared understanding. Riding back to his ranch, Silas felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the anticipation of tomorrow. Not because of business to conduct or deals to make, but because he now had a reason to look forward to the simple act of checking on fence lines and perhaps sharing another conversation with a woman who seemed to understand that caring for others was its own form of wealth. That evening, he ate one of Mabel's biscuits with his solitary dinner and found himself setting aside the others not because he didn't want them, but because he wanted to make them last. For the first time in his adult life, he understood what it meant to savor something, because it represented more than mere sustenance. It represented the possibility that someone, somewhere, had been thinking of him with kindness. The wildflowers came to Silas on a Tuesday morning like an unexpected gift. He'd been riding the eastern boundary of his property, checking water levels in the stock tanks, when he crested a small hill and found himself looking down at a meadow ablaze with late-season blooms. Indian paintbrush mixed with purple asters, their colors so vivid against the golden grass that he pulled up his horse and simply stared. He'd ridden this same route hundreds of times over the years, focused on practical concerns: fence conditions, cattle health, grass quality. But today, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, the beauty stopped him cold. Without thinking, he dismounted and began gathering the brightest stems, his weathered hands surprisingly gentle as he selected flowers that seemed to catch and hold the morning light. It wasn't until he had a substantial bouquet that he realized what he was doing and who he was doing it for. Silas Creed, 62 years old and one of the wealthiest men in Texas, was picking wildflowers like a schoolboy with his first crush. The thought should have embarrassed him. Instead, it made him smile. Mabel was hanging laundry when he arrived at her house, white sheets snapping in the breeze like surrender flags. She looked up at the sound of his approach, her face brightening with the kind of genuine pleasure that made him understand why he'd spent 20 minutes selecting the perfect combination of colors and textures. "Mr. Creed," she called, securing a clothespin before walking toward him. "What brings you?" She stopped mid-sentence when she saw the flowers in his hand, her expression shifting to something softer, more surprised. "I thought these might brighten your table," he said, suddenly feeling foolish. "They were growing wild on my property, and it seemed a shame to let them go to waste." Mabel reached out to accept the bouquet, her fingers brushing his as she took the stems. The contact was brief, accidental, but it sent an unexpected jolt through him, the first time he'd touched another person with anything approaching tenderness in longer than he could remember. "They're beautiful," she said, bringing the flowers to her face to breathe in their scent. "Indian paintbrush and fall asters. I haven't seen a bouquet this pretty since." She paused, and he saw the shadow of memory cross her features. "Since your husband brought you flowers?" "Since anyone thought I was worth bringing flowers to," she said quietly, then seemed to catch herself. "I'm sorry. That sounded self-pitying." "It sounded honest," Silas replied. "And anyone who doesn't think you're worth flowers hasn't been paying attention." The words surprised them both with their directness. Mabel looked up at him with new attention, and he felt the same nervous energy he'd experienced during their first meeting, amplified now by weeks of growing familiarity and deepening connection. "Would you like coffee?" she asked. as she always did. But today the invitation felt different, weighted with possibility and unspoken questions. While Mabel arranged the flowers in a mason jar, Silas found himself studying her kitchen with new eyes. The recipe box sat on the counter where she'd left it after showing it to him the week before. A loaf of bread cooled on a rack near the window. A pot of soup simmered on the stove, filling the small space with the scent of vegetables and herbs. "You always seem to be cooking," he observed. "Old habits," she said, placing the flowers in the center of her small table, where they transformed the simple space into something celebration-worthy. "I spent 26 years cooking for two, then for whoever might drop by. Hard to adjust the quantities. What happens to all the extra food? Some goes to neighbors who might need it. Mrs. Patterson next door is recovering from surgery, so I've been taking her meals twice a week. And the Hernandez family has been struggling since Miguel got laid off from the oil company." Silas knew the Hernandez family. Miguel had worked for one of the drilling contractors on his land before the company downsized. Good man with 3 young children and a wife who cleaned houses to make ends meet. "That's generous of you," he said. "It's practical," Mabel corrected. "Food doesn't keep forever, and folks are proud. They won't take charity, but they'll accept a neighbor sharing what she's cooked too much of." As they sat with their coffee, Silas found himself telling her about his own experiences with the community, the careful distance people maintained when they learned who he was, the way conversations changed when they realized his wealth, how loneliness could be amplified rather than diminished by being surrounded by people who wanted something from you. "Money doesn't buy genuine connection," Mabel observed. "Sometimes I think it actually prevents it." "How so?" "When people know you have resources they need, it's hard for them to see past that to who you really are. They start calculating instead of relating." The insight struck him with the force of recognition. How many of his interactions were colored by what he could provide rather than who he was? How many people in his life saw him as an opportunity rather than a person? "Is that why you haven't remarried?" he asked, then immediately regretted the personal nature of the question. But Mabel didn't seem offended. Instead, she considered the question with the same thoughtfulness she brought to everything. "Partly," she admitted, "but mostly because I haven't met anyone who made me want to risk loving again. Loss leaves scars. After Thomas died, I wasn't sure I had the courage to open my heart to that kind of pain again. And now," the question hung between them, loaded with implications neither was quite ready to address directly. Mabel looked at the wildflowers, their bright colors almost defiant against the approach of winter. "Now I'm starting to remember that some risks might be worth taking," she said softly. When Silas left that afternoon, he carried with him a jar of Mabel's soup and the echo of her words about risks worth taking. But more than that, he carried the image of her face when she'd seen the flowers, the surprise, the pleasure, the moment when her careful composure had given way to pure joy. That evening, as he ate her soup in his grand dining room, Silas found himself making mental notes of other wildflower meadows on his property, other small gifts that nature provided and that Mabel might appreciate. For the first time in his adult life, he was thinking not about acquiring or achieving, but about giving. And the discovery that he wanted to bring joy to someone else felt like waking up from a dream he hadn't realized he was having. The dried wildflower bouquet would eventually find its way to a place of honor on Mabel's mantelpiece, pressed between the pages of her late husband's Bible, a tangible reminder of the moment when friendship began its slow transformation into something deeper and more precious. The talk started, as most talk does in small towns, over coffee and casual observation. Martha Henley mentioned to her sister that she'd seen Silas Creed's horse tied outside the Dunn place 3 times in 1 week. Her sister mentioned it to the postmaster, who noted that he'd delivered mail to find them sitting together on Mabel's front porch like old friends. The postmaster's wife, who organized the church ladies' auxiliary, wondered aloud if anyone was keeping an eye on poor Mabel, making sure she wasn't being taken advantage of. By the time the speculation reached the diner in town, it had grown into something more substantial than mere curiosity. Some folks thought it was wonderful that 2 lonely people had found companionship, Others worried about the propriety of a widow entertaining an unmarried man without proper supervision. A few suggested darker motivations: rich men who preyed on vulnerable women, gold diggers who targeted wealthy bachelors. Silas first became aware of the gossip during a meeting with his banker, Harold Prescott, who'd served the Creed family for 15 years and considered himself entitled to offer personal observations along with financial advice. "Silas, I hope you don't mind my mentioning this," Harold said as they concluded their business, "but people are talking about you spending time with the preacher's widow." "People talk," Silas replied evenly. "It's what they do." Of course. But you know how it is in a small town. Folks get ideas, and before you know it, those ideas become expectations." Harold leaned back in his chair, affecting the manner of a concerned friend. "I'm just saying, you might want to be careful about appearances." "What exactly are you suggesting, Harold?" "Nothing improper, I'm sure. But a man in your position, well, people expect certain standards, and the widow, lovely woman that she is, comes from very different circumstances." The implication hung in the air like smoke, and Silas felt something cold settle in his chest. Different circumstances? You know what I mean. Social position, financial status. People might wonder about motivations on both sides. That evening, Silas found himself analyzing every interaction he'd had with Mabel through the lens of Harold's insinuations. Was he being naive? Was she calculating beneath her gentle demeanor? The doubts felt foreign and unpleasant, but they persisted as he tried to sleep in his empty house. Meanwhile, Mabel was experiencing her own version of community concern. Mrs. Patterson, her recovering neighbor, had developed strong opinions about the situation. "Not that it's any of my business," she said as Mabel delivered another pot of soup, "but that Creed man has been coming around quite a bit." "He has," Mabel agreed, waiting for the rest. "Well, I just hope you're being careful, dear. Men like that, they're used to getting what they want, and they don't always consider the consequences for others." "What kind of consequences?" "Oh, you know, expectations, assumptions. People might start thinking things that aren't true, and then where would you be? A woman in your position can't afford to have her reputation questioned." The warnings came from multiple sources over the next few days. The church ladies' auxiliary expressed gentle concern about appearances. The grocery store clerk made pointed comments about seeing Silas's horse at her place. Even her postal delivery included a concerned note from a distant cousin who'd heard rumors and wanted to make sure Mabel wasn't being taken in by someone who might be amusing himself at her expense. The pressure reached a breaking point on a Thursday afternoon when Mabel began feeling dizzy while working in her garden. She'd been fighting a cold for several days, dismissing it as seasonal change, but the weakness that accompanied the dizziness suggested something more serious. By evening, she was running a fever and struggling to keep down even simple liquids. Silas arrived Friday morning for what had become their routine coffee visit to find her collapsed in her kitchen, burning with fever and barely conscious. Without hesitation, he lifted her slight form and carried her to her bedroom, then rode hard to fetch Dr. Morrison from town. "Influenza," the doctor diagnosed after his examination. "She's dehydrated and exhausted, been pushing herself too hard, I'd guess. She needs rest, fluids, and careful monitoring for the next few days." "I'll stay with her," Silas said. Dr. Morrison raised an eyebrow. "That might not be—" "I'll stay with her," Silas repeated, his tone brooking no argument. For 3 days, Silas tended to Mabel with a gentleness that surprised them both. He brought cool cloths for her fever, encouraged her to sip broth and water, and sat by her bedside reading aloud from her collection of books when she was too weak to sleep, but too ill to be left alone. During her delirium, Mabel spoke of Thomas, of children she'd lost to miscarriage, of dreams that had died with her husband. She spoke of loneliness, so profound it sometimes felt like drowning, and of the unexpected joy she'd found in simple conversations with a man who saw her as more than her circumstances. "I didn't expect to feel hope again," she whispered during one lucid moment, her hand reaching for his. "I thought that part of my life was over." "And now?" he asked, taking her hand in both of his. "Now I'm scared of how much I want to hope." As Mabel recovered, their conversations took on new depth and honesty. Silas shared his own fears about trusting his feelings, about whether his wealth would always stand between him and genuine connection. Mabel spoke of her terror of loving again, of the vulnerability that came with opening her heart to someone who could leave her, either by choice or circumstance. "People are talking about us," she said as her strength returned. "Let them talk. It's not that simple. In a town this size, reputation matters, and yours. My reputation can take care of itself. What matters is how we feel about each other." Mabel looked at him with eyes that held both gratitude and concern. "What do we feel about each other, Silas?" The question hung between them, demanding honesty neither was quite prepared to give. But her illness had stripped away pretense, and the tenderness with which he'd cared for her had revealed feelings he could no longer deny. "I feel alive when I'm with you," he said simply. "For the first time in years, I wake up looking forward to the day instead of just getting through it." "And I feel seen," she replied. "Not as the poor widow or the preacher's wife, but as myself, as someone worthy of kindness and attention." The town might talk, and the future might hold uncertainties, but in that moment, sitting in Mabel's small kitchen, with her worn Bible open between Themit's pages, marked with pressed flowers, and verses about love and redemption, both understood that some connections transcend social expectations and economic differences. Outside, autumn was giving way to winter, but inside, something precious and fragile was taking root despite the cold winds of gossip and doubt. The lawyer arrived on a Tuesday morning that smelled of snow, his black sedan looking out of place, parked beside Mabel's weathered fence. Richard Thorne, from the law firm of Thorne, Mackenzie, Associates in Austin, had made the 3-hour drive specifically to see her, a fact that immediately set Mabel's nerves on edge. In her experience, lawyers who traveled that far to deliver news rarely brought good tidings. "Mrs. Dunn," he said, removing his hat as she answered the door. "I apologize for arriving unannounced, but I have some important information regarding your late husband's estate." Mabel invited him in, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared coffee. Thomas had been gone for 3 years, and she'd assumed all matters relating to his modest estate had been settled long ago. The small inheritance that had allowed her to survive in this house was all she'd expected or needed. "I'm afraid there's been an oversight," Mr. Thorne said, settling into her kitchen chair with a briefcase that looked more expensive than her entire furniture collection. "We've recently discovered that your husband filed mineral rights claims on several properties, including this one, in the months before his death." "Mineral rights?" Mabel repeated, the words feeling foreign in her mouth. "The legal right to extract oil, gas, or other minerals from beneath the surface of the land. It appears Reverend Dunn was more astute about business matters than anyone realized." The lawyer opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with documents. He filed these claims through a contact he'd made while doing missionary work in East Texas, where he'd learned about the process from parishioners who'd struck oil. Mabel stared at the papers, their legal language as incomprehensible as a foreign script. "But this land has never produced anything but vegetables and wildflowers." That was true when your husband filed the claims. However, recent geological surveys of adjacent properties have revealed significant oil deposits in this area. The Hartwell Company struck a major well just 2 miles east of here last month, and preliminary tests suggest the deposit extends well into this region. The room seemed to tilt around Mabel as she tried to process what she was hearing. "Are you saying there might be oil under my property?" "I'm saying there almost certainly is oil under your property, and thanks to your husband's foresight, you own the rights to it." Mr. Thorne pulled out a map marked with colored sections and geological notations. "These surveys were completed just last week. Your small plot sits directly over what appears to be one of the richest sections of the entire field." Mabel's coffee grew cold as the lawyer explained the implications. Companies were already making inquiries about drilling rights. Conservative estimates suggested her mineral rights could be worth anywhere from $500,000 to over $1 million, depending on the productivity of the wells and current oil prices. $1 million, Mabel whispered. Potentially much more if the field proves as productive as early indicators suggest. You could lease the drilling rights for immediate income or retain ownership and collect royalties from production. Either way, Mrs. Dunn, you're looking at financial security for the rest of your life. After the lawyer left, promising to return the following week with more detailed information and recommendations, Mabel sat alone in her kitchen, staring at the pile of documents that had just transformed her from a struggling widow into a potentially wealthy woman. Her first thought was of Thomas, who'd never mentioned filing these claims, but who'd obviously been thinking about her future, even as his own health was failing. Her second thought was of Silas, and how this news would change everything between them. When Silas arrived for his usual afternoon visit, he found Mabel still sitting at her kitchen table, the legal documents spread before her like tarot cards, predicting an uncertain future. "Mabel, are you all right?" He'd grown attuned to her moods and expressions, and something in her posture immediately alarmed him. "I'm not sure," she said honestly. "Silas, I need to tell you something, and I don't know how you're going to take it." She explained about the lawyer's visit, about Thomas's secret planning, about the oil rights that could make her wealthier than she'd ever imagined. Silas listened, without interruption, his face carefully neutral, as she outlined the possibilities Mr. Thorne had described. "So you see," she concluded, "everything has changed. I might not be the poor widow you've been visiting out of kindness." "Kindness?" Silas repeated, and something in his tone made her look up sharply. "I didn't mean... Is that what you think this has been? Charity visits to the unfortunate widow?" "I don't know what to think anymore." Mabel's voice was small, uncertain. "A few hours ago, I was worried about having enough money for winter heating oil. Now I'm told I might be sitting on an oil fortune. Everything I thought I knew about my situation, about myself, about us." "About us? Don't you see? If I'm wealthy, or potentially wealthy, then your interest in me can't be about..." She stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Can't be about what, Mabel?" "About taking care of someone who needs taking care of. About feeling sorry for the struggling seamstress who can barely make ends meet." Silas was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with an expression she couldn't read. When he finally spoke, his voice was gentler than she'd expected. "Do you remember what you told me about your preserves? How you give them to neighbors not as charity, but because you've made too much, and sharing makes practical sense." "Yes, but..." "That's not why I bring you flowers, Mabel, and it's not why I sit on your porch drinking coffee and talking about everything and nothing. I don't come here because you need me. I come here because I need you. But now that I might have money, now that you might have money, you're wondering if I'll still want to be here. And I'm wondering if you'll still want me to be here, or if you'll think I'm interested in your newfound wealth." The honesty of his words hit her like a physical blow. In her anxiety about how the money would change his perception of her, she'd overlooked how it might change her perception of him. "I hadn't thought about it that way," she admitted. "Money changes things, Mabel. I know that better than most. It makes people question motivations, their own and others. It makes everything more complicated." "Are you saying this changes how you feel about me?" "I'm saying it changes how other people will see us. And it gives us both new reasons to doubt ourselves and each other." They sat in silence as the implications settled between them. The oil rights that could provide Mabel with security and independence also threatened to poison the simple, honest connection they'd built over weeks of shared coffee and conversation. "There's something else," Mabel said finally. "The lawyer mentioned that some companies are already making inquiries. Apparently, word has gotten out about the geological surveys, and there are people who would prefer to acquire these rights through negotiation rather than wait for me to understand their full value." "What kind of negotiation?" "The kind that involves making me offers I might not fully understand, or creating pressure to sell quickly before I can make informed decisions." Silas's expression hardened. "You mean they're planning to take advantage of a widow who doesn't understand the oil business?" That appears to be a possibility the lawyer wanted me to be aware of. Then it's a good thing you have someone who does understand business to help you navigate this. Do I? Mabel asked quietly, because I'm not sure I know how to tell the difference between someone helping me and someone helping himself to what I might have. The question hung between them like a challenge, forcing both to confront the uncomfortable reality that money, even the mere possibility of money, had already begun to complicate the honest simplicity of what they'd found together. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, covering Mabel's garden with a blanket of white that would protect the roots of her plants through the cold months ahead. But inside her warm kitchen, two hearts that had been growing closer now faced their first real test of trust, doubt, and the question of whether love could survive the complications that wealth, even unexpected wealth, inevitably brings. The representatives from Consolidated Petroleum arrived on Thursday morning in a convoy of black cars that looked more like a funeral procession than a business meeting. Mabel watched from her kitchen window as three men in expensive suits emerged, their eyes surveying her modest property with the calculating assessment of predators sizing up prey. She'd spent the past week trying to understand the legal documents Mr. Thorne had left with her, consulting with Silas about the technical aspects of oil extraction and mineral rights. Their conversations had been careful, formal, both of them dancing around the new awkwardness that the money had introduced into their relationship. Where once they'd talked easily about everything and nothing, now every exchange carried the weight of unspoken questions about motivation and trust. The lead representative, a man named Carson Brooks, who wore his authority like an expensive cologne, knocked on her door with the confident air of someone accustomed to getting his way. "Mrs. Dunn, I'm Brooks from Consolidated Petroleum. I believe you've been expecting us." Mabel hadn't been expecting them, but she invited them in anyway, her ingrained hospitality warring with her instinctive distrust of their polished presentation. They arranged themselves around her small kitchen table, their briefcases and tablets, making her simple space feel suddenly inadequate. "We're prepared to make you a very generous offer for your mineral rights." Brooks began without preamble, opening a folder that contained what appeared to be a prepared contract. $500,000, cash, with closing possible within the week. The amount was staggering more money than Mabel had ever imagined possessing. But something in Brooks's manner, the way he presented the offer as though it were non-negotiable, made her cautious. "That's very generous," she said carefully, "but I understand the rights might be worth considerably more." "Who told you that?" Brooks's tone sharpened. "Mrs. Dunn, I hope you haven't been receiving advice from people who don't understand the complexities of the oil business. Development costs are enormous, and there's always the risk that wells won't produce as expected." One of his associates, a younger man with cold eyes, leaned forward. "The thing is, Mrs. Dunn, oil exploration is a risky business. Companies can spend millions on wells that turn out dry. This offer guarantees you a substantial sum with no risk on your part. But if the wells do produce as expected—" "That's a big if," Brooks replied smoothly. "And even if they do, the legal complexities of royalty arrangements, the ongoing costs of extraction, the volatility of oil prices, well, let's just say that immediate cash in hand is often preferable to the uncertainty of future returns." As they spoke, Mabel noticed details that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The way they exchanged glances when they thought she wasn't looking. The subtle pressure in their language, designed to make her doubt her own judgment. The fact that they'd arrived with a completed contract as though her agreement was a foregone conclusion. "I'll need time to consider your offer," she said finally. "Of course," Brooks replied, though his smile didn't reach his eyes. "But I should mention that this offer has a limited window. Market conditions change rapidly in our business, and we can't guarantee these terms will remain available indefinitely." "How long do I have?" "Let's say until Monday. That gives you the weekend to think it over." After they left, Mabel sat alone with the contract, feeling overwhelmed by the magnitude of the decision facing her. $500,000 was more than enough to transform her life, to provide security she'd never dreamed of having. but the lawyer's earlier estimates suggested the rights might be worth twice that amount, possibly more. She was still staring at the papers when Silas arrived for their afternoon visit, his expression grim as he noticed the tire tracks from the petroleum company vehicles. "They came to see you," he said without preamble. "How did you know?" 3 black sedans driving through the valley tend to get noticed. Word travels fast in a county this size. He settled into the chair across from her, his eyes going to the contract on the table. What did they offer? $500,000. Cash. Immediate closing. Silas was quiet for a moment, and she could see him working through calculations in his head. "It's a substantial offer," he said finally. But it's probably less than half of what those rights are actually worth. And the timeline they're pushing suggests they're hoping you'll accept before you have time to fully understand your options. "That's what I was afraid of." Mabel pushed the contract across the table to him. "Would you look at this? Tell me what you think of the terms." Silas studied the document with the careful attention of someone who'd spent decades negotiating complex agreements. His expression grew increasingly dark as he read. "This is worse than I thought," he said finally. "These aren't just unfavorable terms, they're predatory. Look at this clause about future development costs, and this one about environmental liability. They're structured so that even if the wells produce beyond expectations, you'd end up responsible for a significant portion of the ongoing expenses. Meaning they could drill successful wells on your property, and you could still end up owing them money instead of receiving royalties." Silas's voice carried a cold anger that Mabel had never heard before. "This isn't a legitimate business offer. This is fraud, dressed up in legal language. What should I do?" "Don't sign anything. Give me permission to have my attorney review their proposal and draft a counteroffer that actually protects your interests." Mabel studied his face, seeing the protective anger there, the genuine concern for her welfare. But she also saw something else, the easy competence of a man accustomed to wielding power and influence to get what he wanted. "Why are you helping me?" she asked quietly. The question clearly caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, a week ago I was a poor widow who mended your saddlebag for $15. Now I might be worth $1 million, and you're offering to help me navigate business negotiations that could affect that value significantly. So I'm asking, why are you helping me?" Silas was silent for a long moment, and she could see him wrestling with the same questions that had been troubling her since the lawyer's visit. "Because these people are trying to cheat you," he said finally, "and because I have the knowledge and resources to prevent that from happening. And because I care about what happens to you. Even if caring about me now means caring about someone who might be very wealthy. Especially then." That evening, Silas sat in his study with a yellow legal pad, trying to find words for feelings that had become increasingly complicated since money entered the equation. He'd started and discarded a dozen letters, each attempt feeling either too formal or too revealing. Finally, he stopped trying to be careful and simply wrote what was in his heart. "Mabel, I've been thinking about your question this afternoon, why I'm helping you. The truth is more complex than I managed to explain in person. I'm helping you because you deserve to be treated fairly, and these oil company representatives are anything but fair. I'm helping you because I have the knowledge to see through their manipulations, and it would be wrong of me to stay silent while they take advantage of your trust. But mostly, I'm helping you because somewhere in the past weeks of sharing coffee and conversation, of bringing you wildflowers and eating your biscuits, I've fallen in love with you. I know the timing is terrible. I know the money complicates everything, makes both of us question our own motivations and each other's. I know that saying this now might make you wonder if I'm interested in your potential wealth rather than in you. But I also know that if I don't tell you how I feel, I'll regret it for the rest of my life. I love your kindness, your wisdom, the way you see good in people, even when they've given you little reason to. I love the way you set 2 places at your table out of habit, then quietly put one away. I love that you make preserves for neighbors who need them and never call it charity. I love that you saw me not as the richest man in the county, but as someone who understood loneliness and might benefit from your company. The money changes things, but it doesn't change how I feel about you. If you decide to sell those mineral rights and move away, I'll understand. If you decide you can't trust my motivations now that wealth is involved, I'll understand that too. But if you're willing to risk hoping again, if you're willing to believe that love can survive the complications that money brings, then I'm willing to risk everything to find out what we might build together. Whatever you decide about the oil rights, whatever you decide about us, know that you are worth so much more than these men are offering, not just financially, but in every way that matters. With love and respect, Silas. The letter sat on his desk, filled with crossed-out words and honest emotion, waiting for the courage to deliver it. Outside, snow continued to fall, and somewhere across the valley, Mabel sat in her small kitchen, surrounded by legal documents and difficult decisions, preparing for conversations that would determine not just her financial future, but the direction of her heart. Monday was only 3 days away, but it might as well have been a lifetime. So much would be decided before then about money and trust, about love and the courage to believe in second chances, about whether two people who'd found each other late in life could navigate the complexities that unexpected wealth brings to even the most genuine connections. Monday morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after snow, the air sharp and clean, the world transformed into something both familiar and strange. Mabel had spent the weekend reading Silas's letter so many times she could recite it from memory, his honest words echoing in her mind as she prepared for what might be the most important day of her life. The oil company representatives returned at exactly 9 o'clock, their black cars crunching through the snow-covered lane like harbingers of unwelcome change. But this time, they weren't alone. Silas's truck followed behind them, and Mabel felt a surge of gratitude mixed with apprehension as she watched him park beside her fence. Carson Brooks emerged from the lead car with the same predatory confidence he'd displayed the week before, but his expression tightened when he saw Silas approaching the house. "Mrs. Dunn," Brooks called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "I hope you've had time to consider our generous offer. We're prepared to complete the paperwork today if you're ready to move forward." "Actually, Mr. Brooks," Mabel replied, her voice steadier than she felt, "I've had some questions about your contract terms. Mr. Creed has been kind enough to help me understand some of the more complex clauses." Brooks's eyes shifted to Silas with undisguised hostility. "Mr. Creed, I should have expected you'd involve yourself in matters that don't concern you." "Mrs. Dunn's welfare concerns me," Silas replied evenly. "And frankly, so does the way your company conducts business. Our business practices are perfectly legitimate." "Are they?" "Because I've had my attorney review your contract, and what I see looks more like exploitation than legitimate negotiation." The tension in the yard was palpable as the two men faced each other, representing not just different interests, but different approaches to power and influence. Brooks represented the corporate mentality that viewed people like Mabel as obstacles to overcome or resources to exploit. Silas represented something older and more personal, the idea that wealth came with responsibility to protect those with less power. "Perhaps we should take this discussion inside," Mabel suggested, though part of her wanted to send all of them away and retreat to the simplicity of her life before lawyers and oil rights had complicated everything. Around her small kitchen table, the confrontation that had been building all week finally erupted into the open. Brooks presented his contract with renewed pressure, emphasizing the risks of waiting, the volatility of oil markets, the complexity of royalty arrangements that could leave her with nothing if wells failed to produce. Silas countered each point with facts and figures that revealed the true scope of what Mabel owned. He'd spent the weekend researching geological surveys, consulting with independent petroleum engineers, and analyzing comparable lease agreements from similar situations. The Hartwell Company's well, 2 miles east, is producing 400 barrels per day, Silas said, spreading maps and production reports across Mabel's table. Conservative estimates suggest Mrs. Dunn's property could support 3 productive wells, At current market prices, that represents potential annual royalties of over $200,000. Potential, Brooks emphasized. Nothing in oil exploration is guaranteed. You're right, Silas agreed, which is why your offer is so interesting. If the risks are as high as you claim, why is Consolidated Petroleum willing to pay $500,000 for rights that might be worthless? The question hung in the air like an accusation, and Mabel watched Brooks's confidence waver for the first time since she'd met him. We're offering fair market value based on current assessments, Brooks said, but his tone had lost its earlier certainty. Fair market value would be closer to $1.2 million for immediate sale, or considerably more in royalty arrangements, Silas replied. What you're offering is about 40% of fair value, structured in a way that protects your company while exposing Mrs. Dunn to maximum risk. The revelation hit Mabel like a physical blow. She'd known the offer was low, but hearing the actual numbers made clear just how thoroughly these men had planned to take advantage of her situation. Furthermore, Silas continued, your contract includes clauses that would make Mrs. Dunn responsible for environmental cleanup costs, drilling failures, and ongoing maintenance expenses. You're not just underpaying her, you're positioning her to subsidize your company's potential losses. Brooks's facade of friendly professionalism finally cracked. Mr. Creed, you're interfering with a legitimate business negotiation between Consolidated Petroleum and Mrs. Dunn. I'm preventing fraud, Silas replied coldly. And if necessary, I'll make sure the State Attorney General's office understands exactly what your company tried to do here. The threat carried weight that went beyond words. Silas Creed's name on a complaint would open doors and generate attention that a corporation like Consolidated couldn't afford. Brooks and his associates exchanged quick glances that confirmed they understood the implications. Mrs. Dunn, Brooks said, making one final attempt to salvage the situation. I hope you understand that Mr. Creed's involvement in your affairs might not be entirely altruistic. A man in his position doesn't offer help without expecting something in return. The insinuation hung between them like poison, designed to create doubt about Silas's motivations and drive a wedge between them at the crucial moment. Mabel looked at the two coffee cups sitting on her table, simple ceramic mugs that had held countless conversations over the past weeks. She thought about the letter in her apron pocket, about wildflowers picked with gentle hands, about the way Silas had cared for her during her illness without expectation or calculation. Mr. Brooks, she said quietly, I think it's time for you to leave. After the oil company representatives left, their black cars disappearing down the lane like retreating storm clouds, Mabel and Silas sat in the profound quiet that follows confrontation. The papers scattered across her kitchen table told the story of what had just transpired, a corporate attempt at fraud, thwarted by someone who understood both business and the value of protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. Thank you, Mabel said finally, her voice carrying the weight of understanding what might have happened without his intervention. You don't need to thank me for doing what's right, Silas replied, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands remained clenched despite the victory they'd just achieved. Don't I? She reached across the table and touched his hand, feeling him relax slightly under her gentle pressure. Silas, what Brooks said at the end about your motivations is exactly what I was afraid you'd start thinking once money entered the equation. His eyes met hers with an honesty that made her heart ache. The truth is, Mabel, everything he implied could be true. I am a wealthy man who's been spending time with a woman who might now be wealthy herself. I do have business expertise that could benefit you. I am offering to help you in ways that could also benefit me. And none of that changes the fact that I've fallen in love with you. The words settled between them with the weight of absolute truth. Mabel felt tears she hadn't expected gathering in her eyes, not from sadness but from the relief of finally hearing him say what she'd hoped but hadn't dared to believe. I read your letter, she said softly. Read it so many times I could recite it. What did you think? I thought about Thomas and how he would have liked you, how he would have appreciated a man who picked wildflowers for his wife and spent 3 days nursing her through influenza without expecting anything in return. She smiled through her tears. I thought about how lonely I've been and how I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone see me as more than my circumstances. What else did you think? I thought about fear and how it's kept me from living fully since Thomas died, about how I'd rather risk my heart with you than spend the rest of my life safe and alone. Silas was quiet for a moment, and she could see him processing her words, daring to hope they meant what he wanted them to mean. The money will complicate things, he said finally. People will always wonder about our motivations. They'll say I married you for your oil rights, or that you married me for my social position. Let them say what they want. We'll know the truth. Which is that I fell in love with a man who brought me wildflowers and helped me remember that I was worth more than my loneliness. That you fell in love with a woman who saw past your wealth to the loneliness underneath it. Silas reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small velvet box that looked as though it had been waiting there for decades. Inside was a simple gold band, elegant in its understatement, warm with the patina of years. This was my mother's wedding ring, he said, his voice slightly unsteady. She died when I was 12, but my father kept it in his desk drawer until the day he passed. I've been carrying it for 3 years, not knowing why. And now you know? Now I know I was waiting for someone worth giving it to. He looked at her with eyes that held both vulnerability and determination. Mabel Dunn, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of oil rights or social position or anything else the world might think, but because I love you and can't imagine spending the rest of my life without you. Mabel looked at the ring, simple and honest like the man offering it. She thought about the grandmother's quilt that had been passed down through generations of women who understood love. About the recipe box filled with dishes made to nourish people who mattered. About Thomas, who would have wanted her to find happiness again. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll marry you. As Silas slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as though it had been waiting decades for her hand, Mabel felt something shift inside her chest. The careful guardedness she'd maintained since Thomas's death finally gave way to something braver and more hopeful. What happens now, she asked. Now we figure out the rest together. The oil rights, the business decisions, the gossip, the future, all of it. He lifted her hand and kissed the ring he'd just placed there. Together. Outside, snow continued to fall on the small house that had sheltered a woman learning to hope again and welcomed a man learning that wealth meant nothing without someone to share it with. Inside, 2 people who had found each other late in life sat planning a future neither had dared to imagine just months before. The simple gold ring caught the afternoon light streaming through her kitchen window, casting small rainbows on the table where they sat, 2 coffee cups, a pile of legal documents that had lost their power to intimidate, and the beginning of a partnership that would prove stronger than money, gossip, or the doubts that had once seemed insurmountable. 6 months later, on a spring morning that smelled of wildflowers and possibility, Mabel stood in the small church where Thomas had once preached, wearing her mother's wedding dress, carefully altered to fit her 58-year-old frame. The sanctuary was filled with faces that had become familiar over the months since news of her engagement to Silas had spread through the community, some curious, some disapproving, but most genuinely happy to witness a love story that had surprised everyone, including the participants. The transformation in both their lives had been gradual but undeniable. Mabel's oil rights had indeed proven as valuable as Silas's research had suggested, providing her with financial security she'd never imagined. But more importantly, the partnership they'd formed in navigating the business complexities had evolved into something deeper, true collaboration between equals who complemented each other's strengths. Silas had discovered that sharing his wealth made it meaningful in ways that accumulating it never had. Together, they'd established the Dunn Creed Foundation, dedicated to helping struggling families in their community. Mabel's understanding of genuine need, combined with Silas's business acumen, had created something more effective than traditional charity system that preserved dignity while providing real assistance. Dr. Morrison, who had attended Mabel during her illness and witnessed Silas's devoted care, had agreed to perform the ceremony. As she walked down the aisle toward the man who had taught her to hope again, Mabel felt the presence of all the women who had loved before her grandmother, who had stitched the quilt that now graced their shared home. Her mother, who had filled the recipe box with dishes meant to nourish both body and soul. And yes, even Thomas's memory, which had evolved from a source of grief to a foundation of gratitude for having learned what love could be. Silas waited at the altar in his best suit, his silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. The empty picture frame that had sat on his mantel for so many years had been replaced weeks ago with a photograph of the two of them taken at the church picnic, their first public appearance as an engaged couple, their faces radiant with the kind of happiness that made skeptics reconsider their doubts. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional, but the love between them was evident to everyone present. When Dr. Morrison pronounced them husband and wife, the congregation's applause was genuine and sustained, marking not just the union of two people, but the community's acceptance of a love story that had unfolded in their midst. The reception was held at the Creed Ranch now, the Dunn Creed Ranch Inn, the great room that Mabel had transformed from an impressive but cold showplace into a warm gathering space. The same dining table that had once seated only one now accommodated 30 guests, the Persian rugs warmed by laughter and conversation, the crystal chandeliers casting light over faces animated by genuine celebration. Jake Mendez, Silas's longtime foreman, raised his glass for the first toast. "I've worked for Silas Creed for 12 years, he said, and in all that time, I never saw him smile the way he's been smiling since he met Mabel. They say love makes you rich, but I think love made him human." Mrs. Rodriguez, who had been skeptical of change but had gradually come to adore her new mistress, presented the couple with a gift that brought tears to Mabel's eye, a hand-embroidered tablecloth featuring wildflowers from the Texas hill country, each bloom carefully stitched with threads that caught and held the light. As the evening progressed, Mabel found herself moving through rooms that had been transformed by their shared presence. The study where Silas had once sat alone now contained 2 reading chairs positioned to catch the afternoon sun. The kitchen, once the domain of efficient meal preparation, had become the heart of the house where they started each day with coffee and conversation. The master bedroom held the grandmother's quilt alongside fine linens, a perfect blend of heritage and luxury. The oil wells on Mabel's original property had indeed proven productive, providing royalties that exceeded even the most optimistic projections. But more valuable than the financial security was the way the business had become a shared endeavor. Silas's expertise in negotiations and contracts, combined with Mabel's intuitive understanding of people and their motivations, had made them formidable partners in all their dealings. They had learned to navigate the gossip and speculation that wealth inevitably attracts. Some people would always wonder about their motivations, but their genuine affection for each other and their generous involvement in community affairs had gradually won over most skeptics. The foundation they'd established had provided scholarships for local students, support for struggling families, and assistance for elderly residents who needed help maintaining their independence. As the evening wound down and the last guests departed, Silas and Mabel stood together on the wraparound porch where he'd spent so many solitary mornings surveying his domain. Now the view was the same, but everything else had changed. The land was still his, but it was also hers. The house was still grand, but it was also home. The future was still uncertain, but it was also shared. "Any regrets?" Silas asked, taking her hand where his mother's ring now rested beside a simple wedding band. "Only that we waited so long to find each other," Mabel replied. Inside the house, the new family photograph sat in the silver frame, on the mantelpiece, no longer empty, no longer waiting, but filled with the image of 2 people who had discovered that love could indeed bloom in the late afternoon of life, when both hearts had learned to appreciate what truly mattered. The story that had begun with loneliness and chance encounter had become something larger, a testament to the possibility that hope could survive loss, that trust could overcome doubt, and that sometimes the richest treasures were found not in the ground beneath their feet, but in the willingness to risk loving again. Outside, spring rain began to fall on the wildflower meadow, where Silas had first gathered blooms for a woman who had taught him that some gifts couldn't be measured in dollars, and some wealth couldn't be counted in the bank. It was the gentle rain that would nourish new growth, sustaining the cycle of seasons that had brought them together and would carry them forward into whatever years remained. Years they would face not alone, but together, rich in all the ways that truly mattered.